So thank you all for being here. This is mostly a repeat, but with some enhancements to a presentation I gave on the workshop on AI and democracy, and this is where Maximilian and I met within the IGCAI presentation. So I'm just to give a bit of an agenda, I want to give a kind of, okay, what do I mean by democracy? And part of it is a rational decision mechanism, and it isn't. But I still want to start from that standpoint as a kind of base. And then I want to say, well, it's also a social process, social negotiation. And what role does AI play in coordination, human coordination, and how it impacts democracy? And there's a lot of opinions on this. It's my view, but I have at the end I give tons of references, which I hope you'll find interesting. Um, and what I see as a possible way to navigate the space. So that's what I'm going to do. Uh, First, if we think of AI as a decision mechanism, we we're taking decisions, and any decisions, we have a situation, we have potential actions. Each action has potential consequence, more or less likely, and then we have criteria that make us say, oh, this consequence is bad on this criterion, but maybe better on this one. And we make a kind of aggregate of what's a good consequence, and then the best consequence that is will make us choose an action that is most likely to bring about this consequence. That's a certain view of decision making. There are tools that make that easier, and it's a common view of decision making. If you look at it from the outside, so you have this situation, action, which will lead to consequence, and you have objectives analyzing the consequence. What you're doing when you're making that choice actually is you have a private theory. There's a situation that you interpret, so you perceive it in a certain way, and then you classify it according to, oh, there it could be this situation or that situation. That's a situation schema. You select one of the possible actions you could take, and that's a selection, and that becomes an action plan, which is implemented. Action brings a consequence, but the action plan had an expected consequence, so you track deviations from that. Did it work? And that is a first loop of action. It's seeing, does the consequence match? And if not, maybe I need to review my action plan. And of course, the consequences are evaluated according to criteria, according to objectives. So, but you have a kind of inner idea of how things should go when you act. And as you follow up, find deviations, you do corrections to the implementation, and maybe this goes down to the action plan, or even maybe to reclassifying the situation because you got it wrong the first time. And so what you're doing when you're doing that continuously is it's another loop of learning. You have your past memory of all the situations you've experienced as you perceived them, all the actions you took, and all the consequences that actually happened. And you use that to create a causal theory of how actions lead to consequence on the one hand, and abstraction of situations, and that's abstraction clustering. So this is something we all do. So whenever we do something, we memorize it. It becomes our part of our mental model. And the idea is learning, like learning how to do this better, is a set of feedback loops. So the first one is, am I acting according to plan? Maybe not. What are we doing? How are we doing it? That's a kind of level one. That's very classic management theory, the so-called double and triple loop learning. Big fan of Argyris' first versions. This was a bit expanded into the triple loop learning, basically vaguely based on Gregory Bateson. So anyway, different theories. So first loop, what you're doing, and then improve the why do we do that? How to improve that within a given objective. So this is improving the theory, really. Triple loop is rethinking the objectives. Why are we doing that? What's the reason? Is that really what we should be doing? And this is a trip. And in a way, there's a fourth loop above that, which is learning to learn. Uh, can we get better at uh, making abstractions in the second layer and making recalibrating our choices in the triple loop? So there's really, this is a kind of schematic, very synthetic schematic view of the triple loop. Action, verify, correct, loop one, record this memory and then abstract into rules that you implement. That's loop two. And you reevaluate the goals and realign the rules with the goals. And that's loop three. And fourth is improving all that. When you do that as a group, when it's collective decision making, what happens is first you have can I point to it? Yes, I can. You have a multiplicity of objectives. You don't have a single objective, you have a multiplicity of objectives. Sorry, this is inverted for me. It's hard to point. And that means you have to have negotiation about how we'll reach shared criteria. And the memory is not individual. Hopefully, it's collective memory. It's our collective experiences. And from there, we try to do not just individual actions, but collective actions that are more or less in coherent with one another and don't sabotage one another, as happens when there is social conflict, so that we can do collective action that uh, tracks with reality. In tracking with reality, of course, reality is complex, and also our collective is complex. We have, again, multiplicity of objectives, multiplicities of ways of analyzing the situation and points of view. So negotiating those is the difficulty of democratic decision making. Uh, this is a very idealized view of democracy, of course. Not very little democracy actually empowers people at this level of acting on the loop. But if you think about it, that's another slide, but I will get into more details. But if you think about it, a lot of the social institutions which we have embody a part or another of this. Like causal theory is the work of the scientific community. Uh, Negotiation is part of the journalism process and public agora. And of course, voting is a way to kind of narrow down that negotiation. So there's parts of this which you can map to institutes. Our libraries are collective memory, of course. So there's a loop in which we accumulate general public knowledge that is useful for implementing this at a collective process. But I want to also, I put this model out. There are a lot of assumptions, there are a lot of limitations. We're assuming that the knowledge is more or less accurate. I did say there's a kind of perception phase. It assumes people have the cognitive capacity and time to evaluate all the options and evaluate, which is absolutely never the case, of course. Um, we have limited time and cognitive capacity to deal with this and to do the abstractions. An important point I want to get into is the notion of requisite variety. The universe is complex. There's a lot of things happening. And Ashby, one of the first cyberneticians, said for a system to work well in its environments, it has to be at least as complex as its environment. So it has the requisite internal variety or internal cognitive diversity capacity to handle the diversity of situations it encounters. And this notion of diversity is very important in terms of limited individual cognitive capacity. How does collective cognitive capacity map and interact with individual cognitive capacity, knowing the former is limited? Of course, there's a question of objective alignment. Is the decision process actually aligned with the stated objective criteria? Like often people will say they'll want to do one thing and end up taking a decision based on gut feeling. Uh, And all this assumes that the world is knowable. I don't know if you're familiar with Cynefin. It's written Cynefin, but it's pronounced Cynefin. It's a framework by Dave Snowden about kind of causality regimes. And there's the simple things where you just, classify the situation and follow the recipe. But he's saying in many cases, the recipe is not yet written. That's the domain of the experts. We're still trying to write the recipe or try to understand what's going on. Yes, by the way, feel free to ask, interrupt. I can talk. Stop me. You're most welcome to. And then there's emergent situations where you cannot predict anything and where you need to kind of probe and see what's emerging and maybe act on it to either further it or dampen it, but you cannot make actual predictions. So that's the emergent domain. And there's a pure chaos domain where there's nothing you can do and you just need to act to hopefully drive the situation to one of the more or less knowable domains. Is it a perfectly unprecedented situation? We have more and more with the speed up of technological, I hesitate to say progress, but change. We are encountering new unprecedented situations, and do the old schemas even apply? So the rational decision model has its limits in practice. And more important, it doesn't correspond that much with how we are actually acting as people. This is just a kind of allusion to the codex. We are known to be full of cognitive bias, again, as individuals and also as collectives, but those are not written in. And we have limits. And how do we deal with those limits? Again, individually and collectively. One of the great classic biases is so-called confirmation bias. We look for information that confirms what we're doing. And it's a huge mental flaw. It's been documented by psychologists to no end. And so there was actually, yes, and here we're getting into the social negotiation part. There's a team of researchers that I respect tremendously who said, how come evolution, which is usually quite successful, made such a mess of human cognition that there's all these biases? And uh, they actually said that confirmation bias is is perfectly justifiable as a heuristic in a collective decision process. If there's a bunch of people deciding, should we hunt near the river or near the mountain? You don't want everybody to consider all the options. You want to divide the exploration work. Everybody should hold to, this is my favorite hypothesis, let me explore it in depth. Then you come together and you confront your ideas and maybe you come up with something else. But it can be shown in psychological experiments that given certain conditions, meaning broadly shared goals and enough diversity of approaches within the group, between individuals in the group will come to a better decision than any one individual would have individually. These conditions matter. When you have groupthink, when you have self-reinforcing loops, you're in trouble. When you don't have alignment of goals, you're in trouble. But given in certain situations, collective cognition is better than individual cognition. And this, according to Mercier and Sperber, is what evolution optimized for. We have, and this is why, in that context, confirmation bias makes sense because it's a heuristic to not waste time while you're exploring options. But again, no group think. So again, requisite variety. You have enough diversity in the group that you're actually considering a diversity of options, and you have to have compatible goals. So that's the social cognition, or in a nutshell. There's other views about cognition, and I'm a big fan of inactive cognition. We often end up actually reasoning when we're communicating together. There's some cogitation that happens here in private, often in the form of an internal dialogue with an imagined other, but communication is a huge part of how we understand the world. And so society is part of the thinking environment, or and our environment also. Our lived environment is part of our thinking environment. And cognition is a participatory activity. That's a theory of an active cognition. And another confirmation of what I said about collective cognition is the work of Fishkin on deliberative polling, where, if you poll people, what do you want about X, you'll get an aggregation of uninformed opinion, which can be quite wrong. But Fishkin had people engage in a process where he'd poll them, then he'd have them deliberate about pros and cons. Some information was fed by experts, but mostly the deliberative process was extremely important. And again, if he polled them afterwards, it showed that the resulting emergent opinion was much better aligned with what is known about what works. It's been also used politically in citizen assemblies. This is, again, sampling a bunch of citizens to discuss issues, having experts inform them. So I think I don't want to deny the role of experts in bringing this abstracted knowledge of the situation, but the decision making depends on values and objectives, and that is not expert domain. It's a collective domain. And yeah, that's something I said earlier. Maybe I need to move that slide, but institutions are stewards of the feedback loops that I mentioned earlier. So we use bureaucracy for measurement, and bureaucracy is maligned, and sometimes it's extremely inefficient, but it does have an actual purpose in measuring the discrepancy between action and results. Again, police, judicial, auditors. I think the role of auditors in asking companies or organizations of any kind, are you actually following best practice, is extremely important to identify deviation. Of course, journalists direct collective attention to deviations. So that's part of the first loop. And the second loop, theory building, I did say scientists, scholarship, but culture as a whole is evolving ideas about what world are we in. Why are we doing this? Public agora, again, journalism to a point, that's part of the public agora. Evolution of culture, evolution of counterculture, you often as a way to challenge when the culture gets too calcified. And limited as they are, elections are an institution of goal resetting. And fourth loop, epistemology, can we know better? Political philosophy, can we decide better? This is the scale of improving the process. So I'm saying we've had institutions, some work better than others, some failed, some work. And often I find people are too quick to reject institutions based on their failure and do not see what they have achieved. But that's, again, a bias. We all have biases, and there's no view from nowhere. I'll come back to that. So why the institution? So we have all these criteria of democracy. This I've taken directly from something called the democracy levels framework, which goes into what works. I've bolded a few that are important to me. One of my favorite simpler frameworks is by Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat. He's saying basically the first three, democracy is about deliberation, verification, and accountability. And that's really important. And accountability builds trust, and you cannot have a collective, functional collective without trust. And then you test accuracy of the mental model, collective or individual. You want some action coherence, and there's a lot of trade-offs here. And that's really important. You want the action to be coherent, but if it's too coherent, it becomes totalitarian. If it's too much towards diversity, it goes in all directions, and there's no unity of action. So these are trade-offs. We have to, if we want to have the requisite diversity that Ashbai spoke about, we need to include more people in the process of deliberation, but then you get a more complex result, and the more complex result gets into the limits of cognitive capacity. Will people understand or even read the result? Because, TLDR. So there's these very, very subtle paradoxes of how do we get people involved in that process of engaging with complexity, diversity of objectives, diversity of opinions. And we can have a very atomized society where everybody do their own things. And yeah, sure, that will adapt to new circumstances very fast because someone will find a new idea, but no coherence and no guarantee that it's that accurate to the world. Of course,
Can I
it's
ask a
scale.
clarification question? Just the relationship between institutions and this deliberative process is the idea that deliberative processes play a role in all institutions that are sort of formed in an organic way, or is it that the deliberative process is sort of leading to which institutions we decide to have and enforce?
I'm saying that institutions were a way to embody certain aspects of the deliberative process.
Okay.
They're trying to we're doing this deliberative process
Hmm.
at a social collective level
Hmm.
through these institutions because basically what Mercier and Sperber described was working perfectly well for a tribe
Hmm.
deciding where to hunt.
Hmm.
But when you have millions of people, you cannot have a conversation with millions of people. It doesn't scale. You get the n squared problem. And and that's a problem of scale that all societies live with. And especially if they go through time, I say learning loops have an overhead, which is proportional to the amount of accumulated knowledge. So when a society is bigger, older, more complex. There's been a fascinating book called is it Why Civilizations Fail or One Civilization Why Civilizations Collapse, and basically arguing that societies, as they go on, accumulate a kind of scar tissue. Like this is worked, this is not worked. And when you've developed this scar tissue, you create institutions that protect from this happening ever again. And then another. Okay, let's avoid this. Let's avoid this. Let's avoid this. Let's avoid this. And then that becomes more and more overhead to any action, any decision. And then the society becomes top heavy with all this overhead and fails for that reason because it spends all this time renegotiating these past failures. Is that It's a theory? It's a historian who came up with that. I really find it fascinating. Uh, but there's no question that the more we know, the less it is possible for all of us to understand all the issues that we need to know to take collective decisions. And so we rely on institutions. Okay, science will look at the causal loop, and journalism will look at directing attention to deviations, and deviations will be identified by auditors. And all these things we create these institutions that try to embody parts of the loop. That's what I'm trying to say. Uh, good. So yeah, you can go collectively agreed upon conventions, both absolutely good question, Andrea. Both are valid. I was talking mostly about actual organizations, institutions, in the sense of, for example, journalism is an institution. There's a bunch of people doing a specific job, and they have a mandate. Uh, but yes, conventions are absolutely part of this as well. Um, Very good point. So yeah, you can, if you don't try to cohere, you can be infinitely adaptable on a big scale, but then you have no coherence and you may not be that accurate. If you centralize, I mean, that's the point of you get more coherence, but then you might not adapt as well because you don't get the signal that things are not working well because you're too centralized for that. So you lose in accuracy. And when I say adaptable here, it's not in the agile sense, but adapt to the diversity of objectives? Do you adapt to the diversity of your population? And again, autocracy is scalable because you don't have the overhead of coordinating decisions, but you're not adapted to reality or to your constituency. And the technocratic, one answer has been technocratic, that is, towards institutions, towards bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is could be adaptable, but usually not so much. It should have been harder on technocracy here. This is very informal. Uh, it's kind of coherent, kind of accurate, but does it scale that well? Only up to a point, because again, the bureaucracy might lose touch with the weak signals from what's happening on the ground. Uh, so again, we have a kind of loss. But at least bureaucracy is usually not that bad at saying, this is not working. Let's at least notice it. Uh, they're not necessarily getting the signals, but it can get kind of autonomous. But a good technocracy can be good at looking at the overall plan of action in a certain way. But it's got limits in terms of listening. And of course, what we want is a more dialogic, people talking things through and thinking about consequences of actions, but that is not so far very scalable. So that's the situation right now. I spoke about this. I wanted to speak about the paradox of complexity. There's a cognitive overhead if it's too complex, if it's too adapted to reality, it's too complex for people to participate. And without participation, you don't get an understanding of the diversity of points of view. So there's a temptation of very simplistic rules, or there's a temptation, and that's something I really want to emphasize. The other temptation is to say, oh, let's try to be objective and what I'm calling a view from nowhere. Let's agree on something that is supposedly neutral. And that's journalism often gets into that with the objective, no point of view, all points of view. And all points of view are rooted. I don't believe the view from nowhere exists. It's usually a rhetorical artifact to say we are neutral and you're not. And I think that democratic consensus relies on explicitly acknowledging how the attempt to coming at aggregated view, aggregated criteria for choice, like aggregate different opinions into a worldview, aggregate different priorities into criteria. This has to be explicitly acknowledging, well, this is where we took that idea. And so that if you disagree, you know who you're disagreeing with. And for that, I think rootedness is very important because, and this is really going into political philosophy here, uh, humans learn through transmission. They learn from seeing their parents do something or from seeing, it used to be apprenticeship. We learn from this is the way things were done in society, and this is how we will learn to do that. And Habermas, among others, following Weber, really, opposed the life world and the system. The life world is this embodied tradition as opposed to very theoretical, abstract, systematized. And the system has its place. There are things that are better understood in abstract, rule-based, systematized thing. I believe in the value of being abstract and systematized. But we have to understand that there's a lot of human life that is totally outside of that. And anything about culture, tradition, reproduction, social in the Marxist social reproduction sense belongs to the life world rather than the system. Um, and what Habermas and Weber were saying is that we can see a lot of modernity as what they call colonization of the life world by the system, where a lot of things that were the function of living traditions are being uh, transformed into abstract institutions. Another So that's Habermas. Another political tradition I'd like to mention is MOOF. I'll get into AI soon. Speaking about agonism, politics is communities in interaction and in conflict. There's conflict as part of politics, and you cannot just uh, make it vanish away. It's no the technocratic, let's find the best solution by kind of abstract optimization is not really what happens. What we have is conflict, and you have to go through conflict to identify consensus. Rawls wrote a lot about how we create consensus first by what he calls overlapping consensus. Oh, we don't have the same objectives, but we can do this action that kind of allows both our objectives to be met. And then we can learn to trust one another. And then we can find ways to increase the area of things we actually agree on in terms of values. But start with actions, which are more neutral, that we do for different reasons and as a way to live in a pluralistic society. Um, so I wanted to bring the life world because I think all knowledge is ultimately situated. And that's also part of cognitive limitations. We think things through from a standpoint that is embodied, that is rooted in a tradition, and trying to totally do away with that is kind of it's an illusion, really, because we all start from a viewpoint which is situated. So, what role does AI play in all this? So this is kind of very theoretical. How do decisions happen? How do we try to aggregate them? Now let's talk about AI. On the one hand, AI is wonderful because it's compressed history. We have a gigantic corpus and we compress it to a size we can kind of use. And then we have access to all this collective memory. And I was speaking about the role of collective memory in taking and abstracting worldviews and decisions. It's a lossy compression process. I will not go into all the cognitive limitations of AI. It's been done a lot. I think it's relevant, but I assume you've heard that elsewhere. But it's a statistical process that works at the level of linguistic concepts. It's not embodied, it's not incarnated, and hence there are limits to what AI can understand. I'll say no more about that. But on the plus side, it gives access to shared memory. So that's good. The real problem is it's a black box. When we ask the AI, what should I do, or is that a good idea? It gives us an answer, and we don't know why it took that answer. Now, of course, people point out humans are not that good at introspection. When you ask somebody, why did you take that decision? We confabulate an answer just as AI does. If you ask AI, why do you think this? It will fabricate a plausible answer to the question of why, which may have nothing to do with how the internal ways worked, or how, in our case, our internal neural network works. Introspection is not a thing that's reliable. Again, that's psychological. Empirically, we can trace a lot of factors go into people's decisions that they don't really realize. Um, and there's a whole field of explainable AI that really looks at proximate cause. What role did this neuron play in this output, which is not a level at which we can discuss the pros and cons of decisions. It's too obscure, it's too technical. But that means if there are biases in the AI, they are not accessible. Again, true for humans too, but in the case of AI, the problem is AI pretends to be a view from nowhere, unlike humans, which we know are personal and rooted. And the biases, again, huge literature on this, biases, of course, in the original corpus, in the training process, in the post-training instructions. I mean, we've seen how Musk has weaponized Grok. Uh, we cannot trust the process that gave rise to AI weights. We don't know the corpus. We don't know, like, there are a few AIs that are open source enough that we have access to even the corpus, but those are really the minority. A lot open weight is not it. And biases are being weaponized. Like an example story I've had is uh, Russia implanting false stories in content farms that it knew would be part of the training corpus. And so they're part of the training corpus of pretty much any AI out there. Propaganda is introduced. There are people studying ways to introduce a bias in AI that will surface only under certain circumstances. But it's also true that uh, AI surface bias in very interesting and surprising ways. Like, for example, if you mention Wagner to an AI in the conversation, it's much more likely to give Nazi opinions later on. It's again demonstrated because Hitler liked Wagner. Not Wagner's fault. He was an anti-Semite, mind you, but still, that's not in the music as such. But it's an example of how AI also does these correlations, some of which are justified, some of which are not, and we can we introspect that only up to a point. So biases exist, but more important, we don't know why. That's really how I oppose generative AI, and I want to be precise about this, to deliberative processes. Even if we have our own bias as humans, because we know it, we can deliberate and overcome the bias because we have a primary belief that everybody's starting from somewhere, unlike AI. There was a fascinating article very recently by Acemoglu, he's a famous economist, making the point that any decision involves generic and specific knowledge, and you have to work to acquire them. And then generic knowledge becomes a common good. That's great. But if you have AI giving you effortless access to specific knowledge for your problem, then you've solved the problem. You have no incentive to produce generic knowledge. And he's basically demonstrated through economic calculations that, yeah, sure, AI will lead to individual better decisions, but it destroys the stock. There's a collapse of the stock of general knowledge because nobody's producing general knowledge enough. And of course, all general knowledge becomes inappropriate. And that's without going into the other issue that AI when AI trains on AI, it gets more and more unhinged. That he didn't go into that. I'm just adding that to the. So that's very interesting. Again, AI and collective intelligence. What are the impacts? Again, for general specific is a fascinating angle of attack I didn't think of. The My main is black box versus white box. And let's go back to biases. How people react to AI. I mean, people attribute intentionality to AI. I mean, we humans used to invent a thunder god to attribute intentionality to lightning. People using Eliza, which is a very primitive psychoanalytic chatbot, would say, "Oh yeah, that's really helping me, and it really gets me." And it's limitations of the Turing test. And now, of course, people attribute personhood to ChatGPT or even godhood. I've heard people say, "Oh, it's like a modern god." I think we're starting a new religion here. And AI, because it's fluent and because it's pseudo neutral, it looks very authoritative, and people trust AI more than they should. I've heard teachers actually tell me, they say, "Oh, maybe AI wasn't, but AI said this." Like, a lot of children do realize there's a problem, but a lot of children are also extremely naive about this. And one case of failure of human communities thinking is when you have confirmation bias and kind of a bubble, not enough diversity. And AI totally, it's sycophancy as a service. You're always right. Oh, this is so smart. Such a great idea, such a great question. And this amplifies confirmation bias, which is a total, I think this short circuits our verification, individual verification system. It creates a psychological dependency. I really like sycophancy is addictive, and I think that's very intentional on the part of the AI companies to build sycophantic AI because I mean we all know AI is not economically viable. They're losing money with every query we make. And I really think that this is creating an addiction. And and then we can get into AI psychosis and all that. And the confirmation bias does, I mean, we know also how people who are surrounded by human sycophants get into worse and worse decisions. And now we have automated that process. It's wonderful. And a lot of people say, oh, yes, AI is error prone, but we'll use a human in the loop. And that is, I think human in the loop is totally a myth. Checking is not less difficult than thinking, and it doesn't take less time. So when you're saying, please check these results, should take you less time than coming up with them, you're asking someone to rubber stamp and basically serve as a moral crumple zone. I'm using the term reverse centers. That's Cory Doctorow. He's saying a center is when you put a human brain on the power of the horse, and the reverse center is when you do the reverse. And when you use the machine to augment your cognition, that's wonderful. When you are yourself in the service of the machine, that's what he calls a reverse center. And it's a moral crumple zone in the sense that if you are rubber stamping AI decisions and then something goes wrong, oh, the human verifier made a mistake, but it's a structural problem. Most mistakes are structural problems. And there's observed cognitive degradation. People become less good at thinking the more they use AI. That's, again, it depends. It's more nuanced than that. It depends how they use it. But overall, it has been observed that there is cognitive degradation. Um, so yeah, that's individual human reactions. It can be toxic to individual cognition. I think for me, what I'm trying to drive home is what is the impact on collective cognition? I quoted the Asimoglu paper, and I'll go back to Higgins, verification, deliberation, accountability, and also diversity and Ashby. Uh, we cannot verify a black box. And that's why I spoke about it's a black box. We don't know. We cannot introspect safely. There's no way to know where the decision came from. And if it's been manipulated, it's hard to detect. In terms of deliberation, it's an artificial man in the middle. A man in the middle, meaning, I'm talking to you, wonderful. We're both learning in the process. Cognition happens through conversation. And then you put someone, and then I'll talk to that or something. Then I'll talk to that something instead of talking to you. So maybe I'm improving my knowledge, but I'm not improving yours. We lose the collective accumulation of knowledge that comes through conversation because AI has short-circuited the conversation. I mentioned how is it accountability sink? It's a decision was taken by the AI. It's nobody's fault. Uh, and it's the view from nowhere. So it kills the anchoring in specific community's point of view. I'm trying to say community is really the cognitive unit. And society is bigger than community, so we have to find a way to aggregate community viewpoints. But if you instead have this giant aggregation, which is not, you kind of lose track of how it's grounded in each person's idea. And then it's much harder. It's possible. There are people working at kind of getting the AI to express minority voices or but the basic AI process is let's have a neutral majority voice. And that means if you contradict, you don't know who you're contradicting, whose life you're impacting, whose values you're impacting, because that's kind of lost in the blend mix. So I'm saying there's a big impact on social learning. So generative AI's learning stops after training. Of course, you retrain after that, but then you retrain on some slop also, which has an issue. But you're losing the cognitive iteration, the cultural iteration on new knowledge because it's not part of that process. And the outcome of conversations with AI, our individual conversations with AI, is either lost or most likely captured. If you look at terms of service of AI companies, they will use that knowledge to enrich their own privately owned uh, generic knowledge. In that way, that's in the next slide, but I'll say it now. AI is enclosure of the knowledge commons. If you're familiar with Ostrom's definition of the commons, that's something that is collectively owned, collectively stewarded. Here, they've managed to decide, okay, we'll take all this common knowledge that is the heritage of humanity and make it something that you pay for and that we as corporate entities keep growing as opposed to something that belongs to the community.
Can I just ask
And
a
this has an impact.
question?
Yep.
So should we be thinking of all of this in the context of the usage that you mentioned of access to shared memory? That like this is the sort of uh,
It's becoming own
use
shared
that
memory.
it's
Absolutely.
right. Okay.
I'm realizing I'm totally running behind on time. I'm speaking way more. I did this in 20 minutes last time, and now I thought, oh yeah, I have time. I'll be able to expand a bit. And I did expand way too much. So I'll try to wrap up. Impact on trust, pretty obvious. You don't know who the ideas are coming from. And you get AI powered bubbles like people, again, because of sycophancy get into confirmation bias. Uh, and right now, there's a lot of AI ethics whose terms are dictated by the AI makers. Oh, will AI take over? And that's a kind of not the real risk, and it's a kind of eschatology, hell or paradise. Will AI create paradise or hell? And that's a distraction from the fact that actually a lot of AI companies are aligned with authoritarianism as a value and tons of documentation on that. I'll go fast, but if you haven't looked at test real ever, there's a whole ideological bundle that basically a lot of tech bros, as they're called, are persuaded that democracy is a bad system because people are stupid and we need Philosopher King to take over and take the decisions instead of all the peasants. And the collective intelligence is done by the few and not the many. So there's really and then it entails all kinds of actual power dynamics. Replacing humans in jobs is an objective. People dying. Oh, there's a whole climate change is good. It will kill a lot of people anyway. We don't need all those peasants. That's actual things that are said in some billionaire circles. And very quickly, what I'm proposing is an alternative to this doomsday scenario. And sorry, I'm really doomsday. So there's a whole tradition, and I'll go very quickly, of structured conversation, the idea of making conversations into atomic units. So this responds to that. This is a argument for or against another position. And it's been shown to work really well in medium-sized community with a cartographer, somebody who's in charge of uh, mapping all the positions, all the arguments, and it helps the conversation avoid um, fights, basically, hostility, because instead of saying you're wrong, it's like, no, this is wrong. It's a liminal object. It's something else out there, and it changes the tone of the conversation because you're not talking at the person. And you can explain why I think that you're wrong. This is wrong, because, as opposed to why I think you're wrong. And but it doesn't work well if you don't have a curator. Doing it autonomously hasn't worked so well, but still, structured allows deduplication, comparison of ideas, composition of ideas, um, fractal views. So it should, in theory, be possible. Always it's be done at medium size. Could it be done at a social scale? Well, it does require a lot of work to make social scale mental maps. And again, most of what I've seen is knowledge graphs, which try to have the view from nowhere, what's the actual truth, as opposed to what's the view from everywhere, pluralistic view, where okay, these people believe this because, and this is rooted in their life world, and their practices. And this is what I'm saying we should do. And what is good is if we do that uh, attempt at negotiated sense making, in progressive formalization, here AI can help. Again, going fast, because AI can, what I'm proposing is formal knowledge, the rules as formal knowledge, but formal knowledge is hard to access, again, cognitive overhead. And here AI can act as a translator. This is what this rule means. This is already a lot of people have a better access to the law through asking AI to understand obscure legal texts. And that's a good thing. That's something AI is good at. Translation is something AI is good at. But saying we can even mentor you into contributing and proposing a law article. And again, law is what we have in the current institutions, but I'd like it to be general little knowledge objects saying, oh, this is the archetype we use to understand the situation, and this is past experience, and this is rooted experience of how this has worked in this community, and make that approachable. So we'd have this big collective knowledge, which could be made approachable through AI translation and introduction. And AI can, of course, cluster, that's obvious, synthesize, surface inconsistencies. That requires more supervision because their AI could introduce its own bias. But still, with supervision, we could have it help with surface inconsistencies, do synthesis, and connect a very complex synthesis with my situated view. And this is where I think we can have create this shared memory, which would be based on hybrid AI, knowledge-based style, plus the notion that we're not looking for the absolute truth and connect with that. And but this has to be made transparent, of course, open source, transparent algorithm, transparent moderation, clearance markers. There's a lot that needs to be done to make this work. Always provenance. This comes from this community if it comes from an AI market as such, and curated maps as opposed to the global map that nobody will ever understand, and that's fine. But curated maps to make this is one view of a piece of knowledge, and this is how it connects to other views. Um, how to make that adopted? It cannot be one schema to rule them all. It has to be negotiated, federated, and there's projects I've done. You'll have sorry, I've taken way too long, but questions now, sorry.
No, no, thanks so much, Marc-Antoine. Very thought-provoking. Yeah, so we're almost at the hour, but I think we should probably try to ask a few questions. If anyone in the crowd has a question, just raise your hand. I know I have a couple with regards to sort of applications. So most of it I had in mind this idea of access to shared knowledge and like a resource. Uh, Whereas it seems like these last examples that you gave, it was more about facilitating sort of our own thinking, not so much as like an oracle for uh,
I think it has to be both, in the sense that we need. It shouldn't be an oracle, of course, but at some point the goal is to, through our own thinking, achieve some coherent social scale decisions. So at some point, we want to be able to do aggregation and say, okay, this is what we see that we want collectively, and this is how we'll attempt to do it. But any synthetic abstract view should be connected to, oh, and we will choose to do this because this group wants this, and this group wants this, and this group wants this, and this is how we've achieved trying to arrive at a either compromise synthesis, both hopefully. So there is definitely a goal of collective, hence going into not oracle, but grounded synthesis and grounded aggregation. But if you want people to participate in the aggregation process, this is where helping people engage with the sometimes very complex elements of decisions uh,
but the idea
can use
that I guess
assistance.
is that this is like an alternative to representational democracy. So for instance, like everyone is voting on everything, but you provide them with compressed representations for the things that for the decisions they want to contribute to, and
Yeah.
they
And
want
how
to
does this
contribute to
play
it because
into
you've somehow, like the AI has sort of guided them towards decisions that are relevant to them.
exactly
Okay.
how will this impact me?
And that gets over the n squared scaling issue of pre-AI participatory
Correct.
democratic approaches.
And the
Okay,
Dunbar number limitations, yes,
right. Okay,
of small scale societies.
yeah. Um, if Are there any questions from the audience, maybe? I want to make sure I don't hog all the time. Andrea,
Andrea?
you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so that was super interesting. Thank you for going in so deeply into like the processes of like how we come to like understand the world, and also like the depth of the levels of like constructs that build upon each other for us to like make decisions without like using the heuristics that we develop. Um, yeah, so I mean, I got kind of lost in the theory component of it, and I wrote down a couple of questions like that you had ended up eventually addressing. But so um, I'm just gonna like read one of them. So codify. So this is my back to sort of what my question was about institutions, because in political science, defining institutions is a really important thing. Like things that are codified or explicit.
Ostrom had an article called Grammar of Institutions. That's
Yeah,
absolutely relevant.
yeah. It's I wouldn't say it's a point of contention, but there's like multiple types of, for example, like institutionalisms, like historical institutionalism, rational choice institutionalism. I think there's also like cultural institutionalism, and all those different things get at like how institutions are structured and why they exist, and the forms that they exist in. So basically, what my thing was that codified institutions, they define the terms of engagement and communication really clearly, but there's unstated understandings of those terms, and they can be different for different subgroups of a collective. And when you're trying to make collective decision making, you need to have like a basic understanding of those things, right? So for more effective collective decision making, wouldn't you need to make those understandings explicit? And that's what you were getting at with like AI kind of being a medium for like explicitly defining or outlining the ideas of people and then creating these mappings, right? Um, Basically, like, I guess my other point about this that led to my next question, which is like something I don't think you addressed necessarily directly in this, but it's not about avoiding people's biases, it's about addressing them as part of the collective decision making process, right?
Correct.
Because an opinion can be biased but still make a really good point, right? I mean, like
Absolutely.
in fact, like most of the things that we say are biased because they're shaped by our experiences and the assumptions that we hold, which I remember reading is like referred to as constructs, right? It's about bringing those biases to the fore. And I think what you're talking about also in this, by like having AI be this medium of like communication for specialized knowledge, right? I think that there's like a psychological dimension where people don't necessarily know why they hold certain assumptions.
Correct.
And maybe like there's also, and I mean, obviously there's like pitfalls to using AI to like get to suss those out, basically. But I think that
Oh, I was not going there, by the way.
oh,
Just
okay.
sorry to interrupt. So far, I've agreed with most of what you said. By the way, I want to make it clear, I'm not a. I did gloss over some of the distinctions of institutions because I'm not a political scientist. I've been reading some of the key authors, but I don't want to pretend that I have all the relevant expertise. Nobody can. Uh, but my I totally believe in the value of AI in helping people negotiate with another viewpoint that they don't yet understand. That's sure. But in case of you went into eliciting, and this is where I'm like, eek. I really believe that yes, AI can help people formalize their personal viewpoint because often we have very vague ideas and making it more precise is part of the negotiation process. And here AI can help tremendously. But on the other hand, I don't want AI to be putting words in our mouth because I don't trust AI to do that. And I just want it to be asking these pointed questions that force us to be more precise and to create more less hand wavy, more formal knowledge, but it has to come from us ultimately because I don't trust AI synthesis more further than I can throw them. Is what I'm trying to say. I think every output has to be come from a human ultimately because somebody has to be accountable for it. Somebody has to it has to be rooted in a position. But being aware of the diversity, AI could, for example, point you to, oh, what you're saying may be missing this other group's viewpoint that could be relevant to understanding hole in your analysis. And there AI could help, directing your attention.
Yeah,
Does that nuance make sense?
yeah, it does make sense. No, and I agree with your point. I just, I guess like, where does the line kind of get drawn in terms of like whether
Yes.
the re-articulated response it is actually coming from the person that is communicating with the AI and it being from the AI? Because like I understand the
Yes.
idea of like boiling down concepts in order to create this like general understanding of something, but like a lot of the time for very for complex things you do need like a really strong base of knowledge to understand how everything connects, you know? Like it's like trying to make an opinion on a very complex concept using cliff notes. So there's a point at which like AI will be filling in the gaps anyways, which is this is
Mm,
sort of my point. Like, where does the line get drawn? And so my I guess what I'm sort of proposing is like just taking the like obviously still providing the information because I feel like that's important for people to gain this understanding, especially if they have an interest in the topics, whatever is being decided on. But I think like just taking exactly like what, and that's why I was getting at the psychological mechanisms, like just taking exactly what people say and mapping that, you know, and then kind of like like associating it with other potential concepts. So you get more out of like the human instead of it being um, kind of like cycled through like AI in order to be articulated. Because there's like there's still like an abstraction that's happening, you know. Anyways, yeah,
Do you have
just
a
some thoughts.
final comment on that? Just because I think we should close the recording.
Oh,
We can
sorry.
stay on, but
Very quickly,
Mhm.
I think what you describe is what I most relate to. I think I may have overstated the role of AI the way I said it. I glossed over details, but the more we can do with humans, the more we should. AI has a role to play, and what is clear to me is I'm proposing a vision. It has to be a collective vision, a collective agreed upon vision, and people will draw the line at different points. I don't have the absolute truth either. Uh, but what is important is the whole process of deciding where the line is drawn and deciding all has to be transparent. What comes from people? What comes from the AI? This has to be as explicit as possible for us to be able to know who we are dealing with in our decision making. So that for me is the key issue.
Thank you.
All right. So we'll stop the recording there. Thanks so much, Marc.